You may have heard the old curse, supposedly a Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." The curse masquerades as a blessing, but it clearly implies that uninteresting times of peace and tranquility make for better living than interesting ones, which usually include conflict and disorder and even chaos. The saying was popular in Britain in the 1930s and was used in a speech by British Prime Minister Joseph Chamberlain. Certainly in Europe, the 1930s were interesting times. The saying was quoted again in 1966 in a speech by Robert Kennedy. And for those who lived through the 60s and remember the experience, they were nothing if not interesting times, I'm told. Because I wasn't alive yet. And it appears we may be living under this curse in 2017, for there is no shortage of unrest, disorder, violence, and just general drama here in the United States and around the world. Bombings, shootings, voting and meddling, leaking and testifying and tweeting, and 24/7 news reporting keep things more than interesting. The days of the prophets Amos, Hosea, and Micah in the 8th century BCE and of the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah leading up to the fall of the capital of Israel, Samaria, were surely also interesting times. And for the past 3 weeks in our adult education summer series, we've been listening to these minor prophets as they have lamented the troubles and disorder of their times. They were not publishing tidings of peace, as we have sung words from Isaiah today. They cried out passionately against injustice and idolatry, making the bold claim that the words that they uttered were not just the angry and exasperated commentary of a world observer, but the very words of God. Prophets are prophets in part because they find the courage to speak truth to power. They see injustice and they point it out. They see God's people worshiping all sorts of idols and they point it out. They see a religious system that gets co-opted to cover the sins of the powerful without actually holding the powerful accountable to the higher power of God. And the prophets point this out. Prophets point the finger and cry injustice, hypocrisy, idolatry. They speak poetry that evokes strong emotion from their hearers. They see a catastrophe coming for the land and for the people they love, and they do not hesitate to assign the blame. In the case of the prophet Micah, he blames Israel's leadership, all of it. Political, economic, religious leadership, all of it. He points the finger at the heads of the house of Jacob and the rulers of the house of Israel who abhor justice and pervert equity because they build Zion with blood and Jerusalem with wrong, and their tongue is deceitful in their mouth. Is it not for you to know justice, he says to the leaders, you who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin from off my people and their flesh from off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from off them. His accusations are stark. They are the kind of rhetoric that have us asking for evidence, some proof to back them up. Its rulers give judgment for a bribe, says Micah. Its priests teach for a price. Its prophets give oracles for money. Yet they lean upon the Lord and say, surely the Lord is with us, no harm shall come upon us. But Micah prophesies otherwise, saying, because of you Zion shall be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins. I have to admit to being a little uneasy with this summer series on the minor prophets. I wrestled long and hard with whether to tie my summer sermons to this series, to have a whole summer's full of a diet of these words. It's one thing to teach a class on a book of the Bible and to look at it historically and theologically and to ask the class to respond to the questions of how these words might resonate with our interesting times today. Ruth did a marvelous job of doing that this morning, asking us some hard questions. But to preach, to stand here, in my understanding, is to begin with the biblical text and to carry that text forward, and that is to go somewhere with the sermon that carries forward the implications of the text for the people of God in our current context. Simply put, the sermon in our Reformed understanding is meant to give voice to the Word of God for today. The challenge is this: unlike the minor prophets who may have had some other means of livelihood besides their preaching, I fit more into the category of, what was it Micah called them? Priests who teach for a price, prophets who give oracles for money. I remember first realizing this economic reality in my first church in Virginia, living in the manse, which of course was provided and maintained by the church, and preaching to the same people who earlier that week had been over fixing our hot water heater. During that time, I wrote an application essay for my Doctor of Ministry program, which I entitled Preaching to the Landlord. And so there are things Micah could say in his day and circumstance, the likes of which I could never say from this pulpit. That is, if I want to continue funding my children's college education, which I'm sure they would appreciate. But there is more to my unease than self-preservation or my own economic reality. There is the matter of the impact of our rhetoric on the fabric of society. This week we have been living with the news of James Hodgkinson, who on Wednesday opened fire on the Republican congressional baseball team while they practiced for their annual game to raise funds for charity. Hodgkinson's violent atrocity apparently had been fueled by strong rhetoric, flagrant words he'd been reading on social media advocating the destruction of his political opponents, words he took literally. This man clearly viewed the opposition party as those who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin from off my people and their flesh from off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from off them. And he went from reading words on a screen to putting bullets in a gun. This is what we call radicalization. Radicalization is born of rhetoric. That is to say, our words matter. How we talk to each other matters. When we look at our nation's leaders in Washington, it's easy to be disgusted. Easy to point the finger at how awful the politicians are, and yet they represent us. That is, they are reflections of the clashing interest groups across our country. They are mirrors of our divisions, of our intransigence, our unwillingness to listen to an opposing view. And while there has been an effort at coming together around this tragedy this week and shows of unity like the Democratic team presenting the trophy to the Republican team to be given to the wounded Congressman Steve Scalise, the criticism is true that members of Congress don't know each other anymore. They don't talk to each other anymore like they used to. But the old cliche applies, that when we point the finger, we have three pointing back at us. Our leaders are not unlike us. They really do represent us. And we all too easily demonize those who hold different views. In our polarized nation, we view the other party as one-dimensional, driven by the worst possible motivations. But when we look at people this way, we lose the ability to speak to one another and to listen and to treat one another as human beings. And mental violence can lead to verbal violence, which eventually may lead to physical violence. We might want to say that Jesus is our antidote to prophetic finger pointing, but it's really not that easy, at least not if we read Matthew 23, in which Jesus accosts the Pharisees. Woe to you hypocrites, blind guides! Inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence, like whitewashed tombs. On the outside you're beautiful, but inside you're full of filth. On the outside you look righteous, but inside you're full of hypocrisy. It goes on, the whole chapter like this. We only read a portion of it. Talk about polarizing rhetoric. Talk about demonizing language. Except that Jesus did not proceed to unload an assault rifle on his opponents. Rather, Jesus explicitly denies the use of violence as a means of achieving his ends. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when he commands his disciples to put away his sword, and Jesus goes willingly to his death at the hands of his political, economic, and religious opponents. Jesus is the ultimate antidote to hate. But this is not as far from Micah, the prophet, the Old Testament prophet, as we might think. Micah himself provides an antidote for his own demonizing rhetoric. While he lashes out in anger and exasperation against the leaders of Israel, Micah maintains self-awareness. He knows his connection to his brothers and sisters and his own complicity in the sin of the whole people. He knows that the sins of any community and of any in the community are in some respect borne by the whole community. It is not just individuals who are sick with sin, but the whole community that is sick. And so in the last verse of his prophetic oracle, Micah includes himself and his own rural party as being among those who need to be forgiven. Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over the transgression of the remnant of your possession, the faithful few? The Lord does not retain his anger forever. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. Micah includes himself among those who need to be forgiven. Micah sees that we are all in the same boat. We are all in this together. He understands the need for the community to pray a corporate prayer of confession. And he knows that when he points the finger, he is also pointing back at himself. Micah knows that as a finger pointer, he is under an even greater responsibility to do what God requires, to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with God. And so I'll close briefly with this well-loved biblical phrase, to walk humbly with God. Walter Brueggemann points out that this is not an invitation to meekness. If walking humbly with God were about keeping silent, then Micah would be the chief of all hypocrites. To walk humbly with God means to walk carefully or circumspectly, to walk with a readiness to submit oneself willingly to God's purpose for the world. Micah calls us to live by the covenant God has established with God's people, the covenant established upon the 2 tablets of stone, which command us to love God and to love our neighbor. To walk humbly with God is to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves, not to shoot them, not to seek their destruction, not to cut off their ear with a sword, not even to demonize them with our words, and not to hate them in our hearts, but to love them. This is the covenant that we profess in our baptism. In our baptism, we belong to the party of justice and mercy We are partisans of love, who point the finger finally not at the sins of others, but at our own sin. And in the end, we point our finger to God, whose faithfulness to the covenant is our only hope of salvation. Amen.